Well, all right then. I think we are live. Okay, another Psych Central webinar. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on this, well, at least in Ontario. It's a beautiful summer evening, so I really appreciate everyone who dropped by this evening for our webinar, Inspired Disability, Turning Invisible Disabilities into Triumphs. I love that title. And, you know, I'll do a little housekeeping first, but I will tell you that our guest who's standing by, our presenter, I believe really has done that, taken that to heart. But who is talking now? It's me. I'm Zoe Kessler, and I'll be your host tonight on behalf of PsychCentral.com. Well, tonight, or if you're listening to the replay, whenever it is. And before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to remind you that you will be able to access the complete webinar online at Psych Central's YouTube channel a little later this week. And if you haven't already checked it out, Psych Central has videos and webinars on a wide variety of mental health topics with guest speakers from many disciplines. And I have just enjoyed so many different topics and so many wonderful speakers. I really would encourage you to check them out. Now, during tonight's webinar, I'd like to invite you to just feel free to ask questions. If you look at your little control panel there will be a box where it's for question and answer. Well, it's for your question, actually. So please just type your question in the control panel, and we'll do our best to answer everyone's questions, but we'll also do our best to wrap up the session within an hour. Now, our presenter is going to present for about 40 minutes, I guess, and then after that we'll have a question and answer period. But again, feel free to type your questions in anytime throughout the webinar, and I believe Carter's open to answering questions as we go if they come up. Now, tonight we'll introduce Carter Hammett. He's going to talk about what he's learned from his experience writing his most recently released book called Book of Disquiet, Dispatches from the Disability Frontlines. He's going to share the gems that he's mined about how to navigate life with disabilities, and doing so has joined the book's subjects to become, quote, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Carter Hammett is an adult with ADHD and learning disabilities. He's a social worker, a writer and trainer, and he graduated from Cape Breton University. Now, for our American friends out there, that's a Canadian university. He has a Bachelor of Community Studies, and he holds diplomas in social work, adult education, and journalism. His words and photos have appeared in the Toronto Sun, the National Post, the Toronto Star, the Ottawa Citizen. I can go on. He's an author of 2 previous books, including the well-received Benchmarking, A Guide to Hiring and Managing Persons with Learning Disabilities. And I can tell you that I have used that book to do my own research and to prep for my own presentations. As most of you know, I have done presentations about ADHD and ADHD in the workplace, and I found Carter's work to be very instructive. Hammett lives in Toronto, and you could visit his website at wordgarden.ca, and that's word, Garden.ca. And I could wax eloquent about Carter for some time because, full disclosure, I have known him for several years now. I just think he's a wonderful human being, and he certainly is a fount of knowledge. So, hello, Carter, are you there?
I am, Zoe. How
Well,
are
that's
you?
good. I'm great. And I guess I will ask, you can see my screen with Inspired Disability on it, right?
I can, yes.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to switch you to the presenter so you can do your PowerPoint. And again, I really want to thank you for being here because I think this is a real treat, and I'm very interested in the process of your book. And you interviewed Henry Winkler, right? From
I
Happy
did,
Days?
absolutely.
That is
Yes.
so awesome. Okay, so we're switching over to you for your presentation.
And
But
thank you. And
there it is.
can you see?
Beautiful.
Awesome. Okay.
Beautiful. So
Well,
take it away.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to ask you to go easy on me. This is my first ever webinar, and so it's kind of a new format. I've done a lot of presentations in the past, but this is kind of a new thing for me. So thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure, and I'd like to start off my presentation this evening with a question. And the question is, what do the following people have in common? Henry Winkler, the Fonz, you might remember from TV's Happy Days. Rick Green, who runs a wonderful website called totallyADD.com and is a veteran of shows like The Red Green Show and a founding member of the Frantics comedy troupe. And also Jonathan Mooney. He's a popular motivational speaker and probably best known for a book he wrote called The Short Bus, which really does a wonderful job of skewering the American educational system. So the commonality that you might possibly be answering in your mind right now is invisible disabilities, and that is the thrust of my new book. I think it's probably important to emphasize the fact that for the purposes of this discussion tonight, invisible disabilities are largely going to refer to ADHD or learning disabilities like dyslexia. So what are invisible disabilities? Why don't we start off with that definition? So when we see a person in a wheelchair, someone wearing a hearing aid, carrying a white cane, that immediately tells us that the person might be disabled. Unfortunately, it tends to have a negative connotation because the majority of the time we tend to think in terms of what the person cannot do. But what about invisible disabilities that make daily living a little bit more difficult for people all over the place? We can define an invisible disability as an umbrella term that captures a whole spectrum of hidden disabilities and challenges that are often neurological in nature. Not always, but usually. It's estimated that about 10% of people in North America have a medical condition that could be considered to be some form of invisible condition. Here's a list of some examples that you may or may not be aware of. So epilepsy, Asperger's syndrome, chronic fatigue, Crohn's disease, asthma, and mental health, a wide range of mental health conditions all fall under that umbrella. This evening's discussion is primarily going to focus on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and learning disabilities. Would you believe that there's over 120 different documented learning disabilities? These range from dyslexia to dyscalculia, which affects our processing of numbers, dysnomia, which is word retrieval, and a whole host of other things. Okay, so what are the consequences of living with invisible disabilities? They're not readily as perceived as the wheelchair, the white cane, or the hearing aids, but they carry with them, as a result, a host of myths and misperceptions that are attached to that. It's really sad to believe that in 2016, people with invisible disabilities may be perceived as looking for attention still, possibly faking a situation, possibly being lazy. I've even heard people with invisible disabilities referred to as drama queens because they always seem to be kicking up their heels about something. People with environmental sensitivities who may be having a bad moment because of something in the air or in the furniture that other people don't see. So we often misperceive the reactions of people, and often when we are interacting with them, these people unfortunately tend to be on the receiving end of negative messages, which may become internalized as kids and have devastating long-term consequences. It's interesting to note, when I was interviewing Henry Winkler, his own family referred to him, their nickname, if you can believe it, was the dumb dog when he was growing up. And like many parents, he wasn't aware of his own dyslexia until he was 31. and that was only after his children had been diagnosed. So that's kind of an interesting footnote. This is frequently happens with parents who wind up having kids and they get diagnosed. Now, one of the things about Winkler was that he's one of the people that are prominently featured in my book. I'll backtrack a little bit and maybe describe, take a minute or two to describe how the book came to be. So he was one of the most inspiring people I'd met, a terrific speaker, really connected with his audience. I met him in Windsor a number of years ago. But he was one of the people that inspired me to go back and revisit some of the stories I'd written during my decade as editor of Communique magazine, which is published by the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. I've included a link if anybody is interested in seeing back issues. And the other reason, well, there's a number of reasons why this book came into being, but I had been working on an issue of Communique that marked and celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario as an organization. 5 decades, and I realized that my 10th anniversary editing the publication roughly coincided with that milestone, and so I wanted to pay tribute to both the 50th anniversary and sort of have a look back, take stock. So in front of you, these are some back issues that we worked on in recent years. If you're interested, all the magazines are available online at ldao.ca. And
Carter,
the other thing,
can I just interrupt for 1 sec?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I just realized I have the book in my hand, and I just realized we haven't even described for people who may not have seen it or read it. Are you going to tell them what it's about? May I do a little overview?
Oh, please do. Please do.
Thanks.
Sure.
I'm sorry, everybody. Silly me. The Book of Disquiet by Carter Hammett, it's a collection of really amazing and interesting stories about a wide variety of individuals. Some we've heard of, like Rick and Henry Winkler, and some that we may not have heard of or definitely haven't heard of. And each one of them, Carter tells a story about their struggles with their invisible disability, and he covers a wide array of them, but it's a really highly readable book with sort of shorter chapters that will inspire you and inform you, and I guess that's kind of an overview. Is that good? Does that do it justice, I think?
Absolutely, okay. And thank you.
And I'm going to disappear now. Sorry, guys, just in case you hadn't seen it. Okay, thank you. I'm enjoying your presentation. I'm going now. Goodbye.
All right, thanks. So I was actually one of several people that was diagnosed later in life, and that's one of the things that I have in common with many of the people who are profiled in the book. And it's interesting when you realize that you're kind of left. I was diagnosed at the age of 46, and for many years I was one of many people who were living with the aftermath of underachievement in many aspects of my lives, and who had also endured the negative messaging of families, schools, workplaces throughout my entire life. And that, as some of our listeners I'm sure can appreciate, is not a pleasant place to be in. So when my diagnosis came around, it was after many decades of performance reviews that emphasized really my own disorganization and time management skills. As a matter of fact, my favorite performance review to this day remains something that stated, Carter is excellent at 80% of everything that he does. The remaining 20% is a trail of destruction that the rest of us have to clean up after. That was a typical performance review before being diagnosed. So, another message, I'll give you another example of some of the negative messaging I received when I was younger. I was 22, and I had no idea what I wanted to be with my life. I took a year off, intending to go back to college. That year turned into a second year, turned into a third, and I really was floundering around trying to decide what to do with my life. So I decided to go for some career testing offered by the government, and after 6 weeks of waiting with bated breath, I came back to hear the results of my testing, only to be told that I would probably never amount to anything more than being a janitor or a coat check person, all of them, both of those honorable jobs, but not what I was hoping to hear. My favorite option that they presented me with was something called a chick sexer, which is decidedly less glamorous than it sounds. It's actually an agricultural position. After hearing that put me into a bit of a quandary for a year, and I decided I was going to take a couple of stabs at higher education despite what they'd said. However, the award-winning combo of low self-esteem and crappy finances ensured that milestone was years away. Nonetheless, I did manage to get to community college, and I studied journalism, social work, adult education. Finally got that degree a couple of years ago. So after I graduated in social work, I got a job in a small nonprofit organization in the town north of Toronto called Richmond Hill. There was a learning disabilities office across the hall. It was the Learning Disabilities Association of York Region, and I decided to attend a presentation about learning disabilities. I can't begin to convey to you what sitting in that presentation and hearing bell after bell go off of recognition, just understanding elements of myself as they rattled off indicators that defined various learning disabilities. You know, it was incredible. I thought, what do you mean? Isn't everybody always late? Isn't everybody always disorganized? Isn't everybody always overwhelmed? So I came to realize this was the first time I was in my 30s where something like this had resonated, and things started to finally take on a context and make sense. Now, I wasn't officially diagnosed until many years later, but I did have a framework I felt that was useful. Another interesting thing that kind of came out of this was the fact that I realized that there were very few accessible role models out there, especially people with invisible conditions. So it was one thing for an actor like Tom Cruise to say that he had dyslexia. It was another thing entirely to be able to actually reach out and pick up the phone and say, how are you doing? Let's talk. So a lot of these people remained inaccessible. So years later, after I went to work for the LDAO, I had an opportunity to interact with professionals in the field, the odd celebrity, really inspiring people from all walks of life who were living with ADHD and LD. And I had that opportunity to meet numerous people, and these people wind up forming the core of the book, who I've tried to kind of take a greatest hits package, if you will, with some of the people who inspired me most. One of these is a guy by the name of Ron Davis. You may or may not have heard of the Davis dyslexia method, but it's a system that uses visuals and kinesthetic exercises to fill in gap words like articles, prepositions, and conjunctions that can't easily be associated with pictures. So what happens is he gets participants to use clay to spell out a word, and that word becomes the anchor which the reader associates with something that they've created to fill in the gaps while reading. So prepositions like in, into, at, to, over, above, under, through, etc., often interrupt the process of reading in his philosophy. So the next slide is an example of what I'm talking about. A child has taken some clay and created the word and, which can be perceived as kind of abstract. And so she's created two friends, and it's called you and I. That word now becomes an anchor word, and she's incorporated that into her reading development. And that is just one of the people who have inspired me many, many times. The program, the Davis Dyslexia program, has actually been incorporated formally into Iceland's academic schedule for people who are struggling with reading. So it's been helping many, many people over the world and continues to gain popularity. Okay, so I'm going to try and be as mindful of the time as possible. It's amazing how fast things are going, how fast it's going. But I began to, after gathering all of these inspiring people into the book, I realized that there were themes linking these individuals, and they shared some traits, both in terms of growing up, but also in terms of the strategies they developed to become successful in their chosen fields. It's interesting that the median age of many of these people falls somewhere between 50 and 65. So many of the people who are profiled in the book were born or were living just slightly before learning disabilities started to become acknowledged and defined. As a result, they tended to be misdiagnosed or diagnosed with their conditions much, much later in life. They also grew up during a time when the medical model was considered the primary form of treatment, thereby placing their conditions in a negative context. And another quality that they shared was that most of them grew up in relative isolation. They were underachievers, and they had to develop coping strategies and a sense of peace and acceptance that helped them integrate their conditions. The other thing that's really interesting, not surprising, but interesting, is that the great majority of the people in this book are actually self-employed. They're journalists, they're actors, they are teachers, they're engineers, they're artists, and the list goes on. So, I want to sort of step off to the left for a second and introduce another element of the book which has contributed to some of the struggles that people go through, and that has to do, I realized, like, since we live in such a cross-cultural and diverse society, there are many different interpretations of learning disabilities as seen through the eyes of different cultures. And there's a chapter in the book that addresses this. And I'd like to share with you one little anecdote about a woman living with ADHD and something called a nonverbal LD, which sometimes gets mistaken for Asperger's, but shares a lot of its qualities. And she asked her mother, after living for 37 years with this condition, she asked her mother in Mandarin how she explained her daughter's disability to the rest of the family. And what came back to her was really surprising. She learned, for example, that there was no word in Mandarin to describe her disability, and the closest approximation was the word slow, or the term incapable of learning. So there was no distinction made between Down syndrome or central auditory processing disorder, and both of those things become very telling in a kind of a cultural context. So I want to just share with you a couple of things that may shed some light on how people perceive invisible disabilities. So what happens here is you've got layers of invisibility. 2008 study by the National Association for the Education of African American Children with Learning Disabilities stated that African American kids represented about 15% of all students. That figure jumped to 21% of all students considered to have a learning disability. It was further escalated to 29% under the category of mental health or emotional disturbance, and it jumped to 31% of all students represented considered to have an intellectual disability. There are also huge discrepancy in the dropout rates between white kids with disabilities and their non-white counterparts. Why does this happen? There are a number of reasons. An individual from a collective culture a collectivist culture rather, may experience conflict around the issues of identity, inclusion, and belonging. Collectivist cultures have a tendency to place more value and promote the needs of the whole over its individual parts. And the impact that this may have on members of the community with LD or ADHD may in fact have their individuals' differences disguised, dismissed, or simply denied by the community of which they're a part. What happens to those poor individuals? They're left to flounder and experience shame and marginalization within their own community. And as a result, they've got an incomplete sense of belonging and cultural identity. In the process of doing so, they may in fact actually be denied access to interventions that could lead to both individual and collective success. I'm going to share with you one or two more anecdotes before moving on, which I hope will sort of shed light on the invisible perception of invisible disabilities. One of these is another 2008 study where Lebanese teachers and parents were asked to observe and comment on vignettes of kids with various ADHD subtypes. It's interesting to note that the teachers didn't observe any medical conditions at all, and many parents interpreted the behaviors as being positive when the child was a boy. So therefore, it can be seen that the recognition of ADHD symptoms depend on the norms of behavior commonly accepted in a particular culture. Some behaviors like rote learning and talking out of turn may in fact actually not only be perceived as acceptable but assets as well, actually healthy behaviors. So before we move on, one more quick anecdote. There was a controversial article I wanted to draw attention to that was published in 2012 in Psychology Today by a psychologist by the name of Marilyn Wedge. It was entitled, "Why Don't French Kids Have ADHD?" And it shed light on a psychosocial approach French psychiatrists take towards the condition. About 9% of all school-aged kids in the U.S. are diagnosed with ADHD. In France, it's interesting to note that that figure drops to 0.5%. And so the article contrasts various treatments and approaches to ADHD, and for example in the States the preferred treatment is medication, but the solution preferred by the French is psychotherapy and counseling. The approach also tends to look at the underlying causes of the symptoms. The French, as it turns out, also have a completely different classification system for defining childhood emotional issues, and that narrows the definition of ADHD considerably. So the French model also takes into account nutrition, processed food as contributing factors, and discipline, forms of discipline widely vary as well. The French thinking encourages kids to feel that the word no rescues them from the tyranny of their own desires. I love that. So all of this, as you can see, is vastly different from the American model. It's a socio-cultural perspective. It's not entirely new, but relatively new in terms of when we've been looking at nothing but biological and medical perspectives up until a relatively recent period in time. So you can see that the context of invisible disabilities will vary from culture to culture and place to place. And that brings me to some of the solutions that the people in Book of Disquiet have developed. These are some of the attributes that when I was reviewing and collecting the material for the book, noticed that they had in common. And the 3 R's used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic. In this case, it's resilience, risk, and reframing. And to that, I add spirituality. These are all common to many people in the book as they've developed and matured into three-dimensional human beings. So I'd like to walk through each of these items and draw your attention to a few of these. So the first is resilience. The dictionary, the standard dictionary of resilience is defined as the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens. It can also be seen as the ability of something to return to its original shape after it's been pulled, stretched, pressed, and bent. Now, there's a wonderful organization, nonprofit in Toronto called Integra. It's a mental health counseling center that focuses on working with kids with ADHD and learning disabilities. And They have defined resilience as the ability to cope with and overcome adversity, which is essential for all children, particularly those with invisible disabilities. Resilience is a powerful force in helping children overcoming both major challenges but also everyday stresses. It's perceived to be essential for healthy development in children. So how do we go about cultivating resilience in kids so that they can grow up to become successful adults? Here's a couple of suggestions here. It's developed by successfully moving through challenging situations, and again, your parents are perceived as partners every step of the way in this process. It includes trial and error. Trial and error, all process is really process of elimination as you work towards achieving a goal. It has to do with recovery from disappointments, realistic goal setting, successful problem solving, being successfully with others. And here I'd like to point out that the foundations for the development of executive functionings are encouraged to begin at a relatively young age, which are perceived as being essential for success in today's workplace. So that's important to note. So parents can play a key role in the development of resilience in their kids, although they need to simply recognize that fixing a problem isn't sufficient, and they need to work with their children to identify and use their strengths in order to face day-to-day challenges. So I think it's important to acknowledge that research demonstrates that others' perceptions, especially parents, have a huge impact on a child's self-perception. Kids are easily swayed by the reactions of others. The world is a whole sensory process as they're growing up, and how you feel about the child can be transmitted verbally and or non-verbally. So it's important for parents not to measure the success by how they think the child should do. I'm thinking of parents who enroll their kids into sports and expect them to be performing at professional levels. All right, so I'm going to move over to risk-taking, just to kind of move things along here. It's the next element in the successful development of people who have developed successful coping strategies. And it's an essential, so after the foundation of resilience has been established, risk-taking kind of kicks in as people mature and develop in their age. It's really an essential part of having a growth mindset. Dr. Carol Dweck, professor of psychology at Stanford University, defines this growth mindset as focusing on developing and stretching our mindsets through a love of learning and embracing challenges. We can change our mindset by motivating ourselves to fulfill our potential. And by continuing to try, even when we want to give up, taking risks, trying new things, and telling ourselves that we can do it, we're expanding our growth mindset. We not only need to model courage, we also need to support younger people to develop that sense of courage, whether it's something as small as speaking up in class, pursuing something you're interested in, or stepping up as a leader. When I was putting together this presentation, I was reminded of the disproportionate number of dyslexic entrepreneurs out there. And there are many. Richard Branson comes to mind. There are Tommy Hilfiger, a couple of others who have been extremely successful. And there was a British study that was conducted a couple of years ago that measured the propensity for risk-taking between dyslexic entrepreneurs and non-dyslexic entrepreneurs, and found out that there was really no difference. One of the reasons that was proposed was that the entrepreneurs selected might not actually even perceive that a risk exists. On a statistical basis, British entrepreneurs are twice as likely to live with dyslexia rather than the average person. The rate rises to 3 times more likely in the U.S. So research found out that people with dyslexia were more likely to start their businesses right after school, in fact, own a a successive number of businesses, run them for shorter periods of time, and grow it more quickly than their non-disabled counterparts. So one of the interesting outcomes of the study was that it revealed that not many entrepreneurs with dyslexia in the UK actually made it to university. However, in the US, many obtained at least some post-secondary achievement through their community college, so therefore their sense of self-worth and self-esteem was a little bit higher. One of the common elements that you hear frequently about in people with dyslexia, with ADHD, is the concept of underachievement, and that is a cross that many of us bear, myself included. And it was interesting that everybody felt that they had actually underachieved, and this is no different between people in the States, in North America, or in Britain. And the folks in Britain had felt crushed by their education, whereas in the U.S. they had people that had supported them. They had mentors, and their confidence levels were actually much, much higher. So one of the next thing I'd like to address is reframing. This is probably my favorite. It's a very, very powerful tool. And I'd like to define it by saying that it's a technique for altering negative thought patterns by deliberately replacing them with positive ones and positive and constructive self-talk. For example, professional competitive athletes might reframe negative self-talk following a team loss by telling themselves that it was a useful learning experience, including strategies employed by their victors, which they can keep in their mindset the next time they compete against one another. Reframing is also known as cognitive restructuring. So I want to use ADHD as a primary example. Seen from the point of view of children with ADHD, the environments they frequently grow up in are filled with negative messaging that's usually about controlling their behavior. Many kids will successfully integrate the ADHD label, but it's interesting to note how many will internalize those negative messages received during childhood, and this will contribute to low self-esteem, poor self-image, less control over self-regulation. So the messages are repeated over time. They have a huge impact on identity and adult behaviors, relationships, career, and other aspects of life. So psychologist E.J. Smith in 2006 designed a strength-based model for at-risk youth. It is interesting to see how nicely this actually transfers over to younger people with ADHD. So the model represents a shift away from the medical model, which focuses on disease and instead emphasizes strengths, skills, and positive attributes of the child living with the condition. Focusing on what's done well boosts self-confidence, self-esteem, and helps the people to develop far more effective coping strategies as adults. So I think it's really important to realize that both kids in particular, living with ADHD and learning disabilities often demonstrate multiple strengths, and some of these include things like big picture thinking. They're bigger risk takers. They tend to think out of the box a little bit more. A friend of mine says, why bother focusing on thinking out of the box? Why not just build a better box? Anyway, they have imagination and intellect. They have tend to have strong leadership skills, great conceptualization skills because they often tend to think in pictures, very visual people. They tend to also be good at fairly good at multitasking, although the value of that particular skill is the jury's still out on that one. So, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it's still required in many workplaces today. So, okay. They complement these strategies with, so if you're able to complement these strategies with accommodations like structuring, fidget to focus, chunking, you can actually bolster your performance. Unfortunately, adults living with memories of stigma and negative labeling throughout childhood find that adult has developed into something, a place where suffering and misery and a chronic sense of underachievement is unfortunately the norm. So when you are looking at strengths-based theory, individuals with invisible disabilities can benefit from a model of encouraging support and the development from the systems within society that focus on the positive and strengths. So people with ADHD need a balanced treatment plan that focuses on managing undesirable behaviors, but also builds on the strengths that they've had help identifying. It's not just the person with the disability that needs to reframe their experience. This is important. Different observers have noticed a second revolution occurring in the way disabilities are defined, okay? And so it's actually society in some respects and the professionals who are working with people with ADHD that need to reframe invisible disabilities as well. All the onus shouldn't necessarily be on the people who are living with them. In fact, they may not have the skills. So when experiencing negative or unmanageable symptoms of an individual diagnosed with ADHD in the classroom, in a workplace, it's really, really important to focus on the person's positive strengths and character traits. An agenda for change within ADHD support systems must begin as society begins to understand the implications that negative labeling and underachievement can have. Stakeholders impacted by ADHD, both directly and indirectly, need to move the label of ADHD from the concept of a disease to a socially constructed concept of intentional positive support for the ADHD individual's strengths, talent, abilities, and interests. Okay, and the last thing I want to say, the last quality that people in the book seem to have developed is a sense of spirituality. This is not the context to have a huge discussion. Each one of these elements that we're discussing is a workshop in itself. However, what I've noticed, and there is a chapter on, the last chapter in the book actually focuses on how people with invisible disabilities have found various aspects and defined their own sense of spirituality. And really, at the end of the day, it's largely about what you define it to be, whether placed in a religious context or not. One thing I'd like to mention is that a particular pathway gradually achieving more prominence is the concept of mindfulness. And that's something that many individuals within my book have acknowledged as being critical to their success. Mindfulness can be defined as the non-evaluative, present-centered awareness that results from the deliberate focusing and refocusing of attention on sensations, thoughts, and feelings as they arise on a moment-by-moment basis. Some propose an operational definition of mindfulness consisting of two components: self-regulation, really important for folks with ADD and learning disabilities. So self-regulation of attention and a curious and accepting attitude towards experience. All right. In summary, we are officially almost at the end here with time to spare. So people with invisible disabilities have a lot to offer the world. The people in the book have gone on to achieve master's degrees after being humiliated in childhood and accomplished wonderful things. Many of us, unfortunately, lack positive role models largely because they're invisible. We have, unfortunately, tended to internalize negative messaging, which impacts our self-esteem. And the very fact that we may not be aware of the fact that we have a disability can really have a devastating impact on understanding the nature of the disability itself. It can impact self-esteem and many, many different variables throughout our lives, including our work, our relationships with our families. However, there is good news, and things like early detection is becoming much more prominent. There's support available through more community agencies, schools, advocacy groups, changes in human rights legislation, and accessible policies have all played a valuable role in helping people identify their disabilities earlier and helping them develop coping strategies at a much younger age. So, skills like resilience and reframing are important tools for developing a positive sense of self and contribute definitely to embracing that disability. And that's pretty much it. The very last focus here is a picture of Book of Disquiet, and it's available exclusively through Amazon if you care to investigate further. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carter. Can you hear me okay?
I can indeed.
Great. It's Zoe again. I just wanted to point out, as I mentioned earlier, I do know Carter for a few years, and that photo, I believe, was one of yours, correct? On the cover of the book?
Yes, actually.
Ah, one of your many talents.
Thank you.
So thank you. Wow, wow. You packed a lot of stuff in there, my friend.
I hope not too much.
Well, I'm going to invite people to continue to send in some questions through the question panel. Please raise your hand if you're not quite sure how to do that or where to access it, but I think we're okay. I do have a couple of questions of my own, actually, Carter. As we were going through the presentation, something struck me. A lot of your materials seem to be geared around children, and I mean, at the beginning it was sort of about adults, but for example, when we bumped up against the resilience part of the 3 Rs, as
Yeah.
an adult who, like yourself, was diagnosed very late in life with ADHD, and I still have undiagnosed, I believe, learning disabilities.
Mhm.
What occurred to me, Carter, was that, if part of resilience includes recovery from disappointments, I think someone who's diagnosed so late in life runs up against, it seems to me, so many more disappointments. I mean, personally, I felt pummeled by disappointments on an almost, if not daily basis. So I'm wondering, what are your tips for developing that part of resiliency, the recovery from disappointments, if you have a different baseline to begin with, if you catch my drift? I think it's
Yeah.
quantitatively and qualitatively a different experience, and then you add hypersensitivity. Anyway, any thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, the resiliency comment was based on early detection and um, trying to cultivate those skills earlier on in life. For those of us who have been diagnosed later, yeah, it's one thing I think that's really important to realize and to reiterate is that people with ADHD and learning disabilities have average to above average intelligence. And I think by the very nature of our disabilities, we're pretty good at developing natural compensation strategies that help us get through life on a variety of levels. So, for example, if people have auditory processing problems, they tend to develop visual skills and will gravitate towards that type of activity. And in the process of doing so, we learn to maneuver around either maneuver around different disappointments or to recognize that there are multiple approaches to problem solving sometimes. And I think that can possibly be one solution, I think, to what you're implying.
Interesting. And I think that, that's sort of, when you said, higher than above average intelligence, I found that as well, and I think that bears out in research. But I would think that that would help with another part of the R, which would be the reframing. I think that because the intellect or the understanding might be there, even just knowing about that tool of reframing it, I think it's easier to incorporate it when you can kind of get a handle on it, I think, very quickly and see why it's so valuable. Do you know what I'm saying?
I think so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, um,
I mean, it takes
once
a little
they've
bit of work to reframe. It takes that intelligence. It takes that understanding to be able to do it in the first place.
I also think it takes a phenomenal amount of pain in some cases too. I think you've got to be knocked down a couple of times, and if you're serious about solving this problem, it's going to allow you to create different viewpoints. And I think reframing does come out of being knocked down and being disappointed many times in life. Now, we've talked about some of this. I think it also helps. It's important to recognize that I've only identified some isolated skills here, but that's also in part of a larger framework that includes things like seeking out a larger community, developing relationships with people who get you, finding mentors, and growing up is a huge responsibility, and there's so many competing priorities that and pressures that come with growing up without a disability. I mean, it's difficult enough, right?
Yeah.
So I think the ability of having support and also access to community agencies, for example, and support groups and things like this will enable you to actually look and then look again, and in the
Oh,
process of
excellent.
doing so, we're
Excellent point. Thank you. That's absolutely brilliant, which is another reason why I hang around you. You're my
ah, ha,
friend.
ha.
You do help me. And honestly, without being tongue-in-cheek, I think, I've written articles about how I think friendships can really help us to manage our ADHD or some of these things, because if your friend can't help you to reframe something, you need new friends, as far as I'm concerned.
Big time. Yep.
Anyway, we have another question that's come in from one of our attendees here, and she's asking, Carter, what do you recommend for an adult who's come to realize on their own through psych papers that ADHD is a very likely possibility?
Through psych papers, that's really interesting. Well, okay, one of the things that I would recommend, so you know what, I had a psychiatrist when I was being diagnosed myself, and he said that if you think you've got ADHD, you probably do. And I'm actually going to recommend something that Zoe recommended to me, which was an online questionnaire called the Jasper Goldberg questionnaire, ADHD questionnaire. And it's a screening tool that's online, and it's available for free. And I would, I don't know, is there an indicator where this person lives who asked the question?
No, no.
No. Okay. So
But the questionnaire is online, right? So
the questionnaire is free and it's online. And what I would consider that you do is print it out and use it as a basis for further investigation when you take it to either a psychologist or a psychiatrist or someone who's qualified to actually diagnose you and take the step further.
yeah, actually, she's
And
indicating, Carter, she lives in the States, soon to live in Illinois. So as
okay,
Canadians, I guess we're not as, I don't know. I'll give that to you.
nope. Yeah, again, I'm not 100% sure of the diagnostic process in the States, and also places, it's going to vary from place to place in accessibility as well. However, if you're a student, for example, there are disability services within the universities and post-secondary institutions.
Colleges in the States, yeah.
Absolutely. There are also sometimes these services are covered by insurance in the workplace. And the other thing that I would encourage you to do is contact your local Learning Disability Association once you settle down. And they will be able to point you in the right direction.
Good point. And they do have, I believe there are learning disabilities associations in the States too, right, Carter?
Oh, absolutely. The
Yep.
Learning Disabilities Association of America is an absolutely brilliant, brilliant agency, and you should really highly, highly encourage to go check it out. And there's dozens of in-depth articles that really do a great job of tracking the latest research, and they have just a wealth of information. And not only that, but the people there are incredibly helpful, and they respond to inquiries very, very fast.
Oh, that's great. Good to know.
Yep.
Excuse me. Now, I also was wondering, Carter, so, you know, you've said this, I think it's in your book, I read it there, but it's the expression, you know, do you own your disability or does your disability own you? I presume that means getting control of the, what does that actually mean?
That's a good question, and yeah, you know, it's one of my stock questions when I work with clients who
What
appear
kind of
on my
clients?
doorstep.
Sorry.
So I work as an I'm the manager of employment services for Epilepsy Toronto here,
Okay.
and prior to that, I worked for about 12 years with job seekers who had Asperger's syndrome and ADD and various forms of learning disabilities. So the question always became, do you own your disability or does your disability own you? And I use that as a bit of a barometer to find out how quote, quote, job ready, which is a term I hate, but how job ready the person was. Had they accepted their disability? Had they embraced it? How much information had they researched about it? Did they understand what their accommodation needs were? Did they understand their interaction with their environment? How confident were they when it came to issues like disclosure, for example? And those are all variables that I take into consideration when I ask that question. And if the person comes to me and they're blaming mom and dad for, you know, reading them books that they didn't understand, or the fact that they may have dropped out of school, or the fact that, you know, things didn't quite go the way they wanted to in life, then we take a step back and say, well, you know what, maybe we should start looking at finding out what your strengths are, and let's do a little bit more work before moving forward with your job goals. And that could include basic supports like literacy, or finding a mentoring program and matching them with somebody who has a similar disability who can help guide them through the process.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
For example.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. And holy moly, I think I warned you, Carter, when we were practicing with the technology before, how quickly this was going to go. I cannot believe we have technically like 3 minutes to go.
Wow.
I just feel like there's so much more to cover. You know, I need to wrap up, but is there anything else, I guess, you want to add? I know that we were I think we've really covered a lot of the information that we were hoping to cover, but I'm wondering about that unique perspective aspect. Can you just speak to that briefly about how the advantage of having a unique perspective due to a disability, how can we maximize that, or how can we leverage that?
For every weakness, there is a flip side. There's a strength that goes along with it. And
Wow.
you need to recognize that you are a unique person that has magic to offer the world. And I'm not just saying that as lip service. I think it's really important, no matter how dark the evening has gotten and how long the night seems to be, that there is always light. How's that for a cliche? But the fact is that we all have a uniqueness that deserves celebrating, and we need to honor ourselves and each other, and recognize, for example, that even though you might have deficits in auditory processing, for example, or memory, that your brain is always going to naturally compensate. And you know what? Sometimes we need a little bit of help trying to identify those strengths, but you will find them. And with the proper support and community, it can be done.
Exactly. And I think also something that's helped me so much, Carter, since my diagnosis 10 years ago is things like, you know, asking you, for example, hey, can you see my screen right now that says, thanks for joining our webinar? Like, seriously, can you?
Yes, I can, actually.
Thank you. Because honestly, not being able to believe in myself as much as I would like, or to take anything
Mm.
for granted, I think is going to be a hangover for me for the rest of my life. But on the flip side of that, I'm so honest and open about things that I can ask you that, and I'm not ashamed that I'm not sure, that technology overwhelms me, la la la. You know what I mean? And I just think gathering a great bunch of people around you, I'm so glad that I've met you, Carter, and you are such a wealth of knowledge. And I do want to thank you for your presentation. And unfortunately, we're we're out of time. Um, I've got a minute to say, please do check out Carter's book. Now, Carter, is there a chapter on Amazon that people can read as a sample chapter?
There are actually, yes,
Oh, good.
and
Okay.
yeah, it's available exclusively at Amazon.com. Just type in Book of Disquiet and Carter, and it'll come up. You'll see
Fantastic.
a sample.
Well, I would
Yep.
really highly recommend that everybody does that if you feel so moved, and then you'll have a good idea of what's in store for you, and it's a real treat. So, wow, thanks everyone for joining us. I just that was like 3 minutes. So we'll have to have Carter back if I can. I'll just beg you to come back, Carter, for more. And I'd like to remind everyone that the replay of tonight's webinar is going to be posted at Psych Central's YouTube channel later this week. And I'd like to thank everyone again who attended live tonight. And to those of you who are listening to the replay, thanks very much for dropping in. And of course, I'd like to thank Psych Central for hosting the webinars. It's a monthly series. I've got another speaker presenter lined up for the last Monday of August and September and October, and hopefully for the rest of the year. And I saved the best for last. Carter, thank you so much for taking, I know what a busy life you have, and we all have, and thank you so, so much for putting this together for us. I know I enjoyed it, and I'm sure others have as well. So thanks
Thank you
so
so much
much.
for the opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great.
Mm.
Okay, everyone, on behalf of PsychCentral.com and me, Zoe Kessler, thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye for now.
Bye.